All right, everyone, get ready because we are diving deep today. We're going all the way back to the 14th century, and we're looking at a sermon. And get this, this sermon says it holds the secret to something incredible, a divine birth within. Yeah, you heard that right, divine birth. I don't know about you, but I was hooked from the start.
You know what gets me about this sermon? It's how it takes something we've all felt that feeling of being lost in a crowd and uses it to explain, like this incredibly personal inner transformation. It's brilliant.
Right, and it's not just any crowd. This sermon takes us straight to that story in the gospel, the one where Jesus gets separated from his parents at the temple. They're freaking out, searching everywhere, and it's only when they finally get away from all the chaos that they find him. But here's where it gets really interesting. The sermon suggests that we're the ones who need to ditch the crowd to have this divine birth. So what exactly is this crowd? It can't be literal crowds.
It's a metaphor. Like, think about that feeling of being overwhelmed, like a million things hitting you at once. Your to-do list, social media, worrying about the future, even that annoying song stuck in your head. It's that inner chaos that's the crowd this sermon is talking about.
Okay, so it's less about actual crowds and more about the mental noise, that constant chatter that's always going. No wonder it's hard to tap into something deeper, right? But then the sermon goes on to say that just knowing about God isn't enough for this divine birth. It's like, I don't know, reading about love versus actually being in love.
Exactly. It's like that story of the woman at the well. She had heard about the Messiah, but it's that face-to-face encounter that sets her on fire, you know? And that's what this sermon wants us to get. We got to move past just knowing about God. We need that direct experience.
Which makes me wonder, how do we escape the crowd of our own thoughts and actually make space for that kind of encounter? Okay, so get this. The sermon uses this phrase. Are you ready? Embracing the unknowing. Now, my brain likes logic, so that sounds, I don't know, a little scary. What does that even mean?
It sounds kind of weird, right? But it's really about turning down the volume on that mental noise. It's about making space for a different kind of knowing. Something that's not just about logic. It's about intuition, deep feeling, a knowing that goes beyond words.
It's like those moments when everything just clicks, like when you're meditating or even just on a quiet walk and you find that deep sense of peace.
Exactly. It's wild how this wisdom from the 14th century lines up with things like mindfulness that we're into now. We quiet the crowd so we can tune in to a different channel. But, this is important, the sermon says we can't force this divine birth to happen just by trying really hard.
Oh, really? So no meditating ourselves into enlightenment. So what's the secret then?
It's about setting the stage, like a mother getting ready for a baby. The sermon uses this powerful image of God's grace just waiting to overflow into us the moment we make that inner space. It's less about striving and more about getting out of our own way.
Okay, so God's waiting for us to make room. Got it. But how do we even know when we've made that inner space? Are there signs that this divine birth has happened?
The sermon drops some hints. One that really stands out is this idea. Once this shift happens, nothing can stop you from living your purpose.
Yeah.
It's like every experience, every interaction points you back to the divine.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. But how does that actually work, like practically?
Think of a lightning bolt, right? The second it hits, everything, trees, people, whatever, is instantly turned towards it. After this inner birth, it's like that. Challenges, difficulties, they all become part of the path, leading you closer to, the divine.
So it's not that life suddenly becomes easy. It's more like our perspective totally shifts, like everything has this deeper meaning.
Exactly. But here's where it takes a turn. This sermon, even though it's from a time when harsh punishments were a big deal, it emphasizes love, like real love over punishment. It even compares love to a fisherman's hook. That's got to mean something, right?
Yeah, it definitely stands out. So we're not talking about punishing ourselves into being spiritual. It's more about surrendering to something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And this isn't about romantic love. It's about a love that consumes you, changes you, like that hook that catches a fish and doesn't let go. This divine love, that's the key, the sermon says, to taming that part of us that gets distracted by the world.
It's like love has this power to draw us in, to free us from all the stuff that's holding us back. But how does this love actually show up in our lives? Is it something we just feel, or is it something we do?
That's the heart of this sermon, and it's something we need to dig into a bit deeper.
Okay, because now you really got me thinking. So
Yeah.
how does this all-consuming love actually show up for us? I mean, is it something we feel or something we do?
That takes us right to the heart of this sermon's message. And to be honest, it might surprise you.
Oh, okay. Now you have to tell me.
Well, the sermon suggests that one of the most powerful ways this love shows up is through acts of service to others. It's about taking that intense, passionate energy and directing it outward.
So it's not enough to just feel this love. We have to put it into action.
Exactly. It's about letting that love flow through us, touching the lives of everyone around us. The sermon actually uses this image of a river, constantly moving, always giving.
Okay, I really like that analogy. It speaks to this idea of love not being static, but a force that needs to be shared, to be in motion.
Exactly. And here's something else. The sermon doesn't shy away from the hard parts of this path. It acknowledges that embracing this radical kind of love takes sacrifice.
So it's not all sunshine and rainbows then. There's a cost.
Right. The sermon uses this phrase, dying to self, to describe the process of letting go of our ego, our selfish desires, so that love can flow through us.
Wow, that's intense. Like some really deep inner work.
It is. But the sermon reminds us that we're not alone in this. It emphasizes that God's grace is always there for us, to support us, guide us, empower us.
So even though it's tough, we don't have to go it alone.
Exactly. The sermon uses this really beautiful metaphor of a vine and its branches. Just like a branch can't bear fruit unless it's connected to the vine, we can't fully experience this love unless we're tapped into the source, to God.
I'm struck by how this sermon brings together these seemingly opposite ideas. Intense love and self-sacrifice, personal change, and serving others. It's like they're two parts of the same thing.
You got it. The sermon isn't giving us some one-size-fits-all approach to spirituality. It's more like a tapestry, woven from all these different threads.
And each thread contributes to the beauty and the complexity of the overall design.
Exactly. And each of us gets to find our own way to weave these teachings into our lives.
So how do we do that? How do we take these 14th century ideas and make them work in our 21st century world?
Well, the sermon gives us some clues. Remember how it talked about finding God in the wilderness?
Wait, you mean literally going out into the wilderness? Because I don't know about you, but I need room service and decent Wi-Fi.
Not quite. The wilderness here is about stepping away from the noise, from the distractions of everyday life, and creating space for silence, for solitude.
So it's about finding that inner peace, that stillness, no matter where we are.
Yes. It could be as easy as taking 10 minutes a day to just sit in silence or meditate, connect with nature, or just be present.
So even with how busy and connected we are, we can all find our own wilderness.
Absolutely. It's about making that choice to disconnect from the outside and reconnect with what's inside.
Which, let's be honest, can feel pretty rebellious these days.
It can, but it's so worth it. The sermon suggests that when we're quiet, when we're not bombarded by everything, that's when we can really hear the voice of God, that quiet voice inside.
It's in the silence that we find clarity.
Yes. And from that place of inner stillness, we can go back out into the world feeling renewed, re-energized, ready to bring that love and compassion into everything we do.
Okay, that makes sense. But this idea of dying to self still feels a bit intimidating. Any advice on how to deal with that part?
The sermon actually offers a surprisingly practical suggestion: cultivating humility.
Humility? Wait, in a world that's all about promoting ourselves, our ego, that seems kind of countercultural.
Right, but the sermon wants us to remember that true humility isn't about thinking less of ourselves. It's about thinking of ourselves less.
What do you mean?
It means shifting our focus. Instead of being caught up in our own ego or own desires, we focus on something bigger than ourselves.
Like serving others, pursuing a purpose, or even just being present in the moment.
Exactly. And the sermon suggests that when we humble ourselves, when we let go of needing to be right, to be in control, to be the center of attention, that's when we make space for something greater to come through.
So we have to let go to truly find ourselves.
It's a paradox, but yes. When we surrender to something bigger than us, we tap into a power and wisdom that our ego could never give us.
That's pretty profound. But how do we live with humility every day?
It looks different for everyone. It might be admitting when we're wrong, asking for help when we need it, or even just listening with an open heart.
Approaching life with curiosity and wonder instead of judgment?
Exactly. And the sermon tells us that it's this attitude of humility, of openness, that allows us to be truly receptive to God within us and all around us.
So humility isn't about shrinking ourselves, but about making room for something much bigger.
Beautifully said. And that brings us to another important theme in this sermon: gratitude.
Gratitude, how does that fit in with all of this?
The sermon suggests that having gratitude is essential if we want to experience this divine birth.
You mean like when we're grateful for what we have, we don't focus so much on what we lack.
Exactly. Gratitude shifts our perspective from scarcity to abundance.
And when we feel abundant, we're more likely to experience joy, peace, connection.
Precisely. And the sermon suggests that in those moments of true gratitude, when our hearts are overflowing with appreciation, that's when we get a glimpse of the divine.
So gratitude isn't just a nice thing to have, it's actually essential for our spiritual growth.
Absolutely. And it's something we can practice. We can keep a gratitude journal, express appreciation to people we love, or even just take a moment to notice and appreciate the beauty around us.
So by finding our own wilderness, cultivating humility, and practicing gratitude, we can set the stage for this divine birth to happen within us.
Exactly. But the sermon doesn't stop there. It goes on to explore even deeper meanings of this transformation.
Like what? Don't leave me hanging.
Well, it suggests that this isn't just about our own enlightenment. It's meant to have a ripple effect, to actually impact the world.
So it's not about escaping the world, but transforming it from within.
Yes, this isn't meant to be something we keep to ourselves. It's meant to flow outward into everything we do.
So maybe that's the real secret here. Finding the divine inside is just the beginning. Then it's about letting that divine spark ignite everything around us. This sermon has given us so much to think about, but I'm curious, what about the people who heard this centuries ago? What were they supposed to do with all of this?
That's a great question. It's important to think about the context. This sermon was probably given to a group of monks, people already committed to a life of prayer and spiritual practice.
Okay, so they were already on a spiritual path. But even for them, this message of inner transformation would have been radical.
Oh, absolutely. It
Yeah.
challenged them to go beyond the rituals and practices of their faith and cultivate a deeper, more personal connection with God. It called them to a level of surrender and devotion that wasn't easy.
It makes you wonder, what would it look like to live by these principles in our modern lives?
It's a fascinating question. How can we take these ancient teachings and apply them to the 21st century?
And how do we avoid falling into that trap of thinking that spiritual growth means withdrawing from the world? Because this sermon definitely isn't saying that.
You're right, it's not about escaping the world, but about transforming it from the inside out. And maybe that's the real message of hope here. Real change, lasting change, starts with each of us.
And by nurturing that connection to the divine, we can become agents of change in our own lives and in the world around us.
It's a powerful message, and I think it's more relevant now than ever.
Totally agree. And you know what? We haven't even scratched the surface of what this sermon has to offer. It's like we've dug up this old treasure map, but then actually using it to find something to make it work in our world, well, that's the real quest.
And that's the thing about a good map, right? It's not about following blindly. It's about using the knowledge
Yeah.
and adapting it to our own path.
I like that. So how do we do that? How do we make these 14th century ideas actually work for us, in the 21st century?
Well, the sermon, it gives us some practical things alongside all those metaphors. Remember how we talked about love being this driving force, like intense, all-consuming kind of love?
Right, like that fisherman's hook. It's hardcore, not your typical love song stuff.
Exactly. And maybe that's the key to actually using this wisdom we've got to approach everything we do with that same passion, that same commitment.
So we're supposed to bring that level of devotion, like, to everything. Is that even possible with how crazy our lives are?
That's where it gets real, right? The sermon, it asks us to think, what if we saw our work, not just as a way to pay bills, but as a way to share our gifts, to actually make a difference?
It's like seeing our work as part of that divine love.
Exactly. And what about how we treat people, not just the people we're close to, but everyone? What if we treated them with that same love we reserve for the divine? Like, what if we looked for that spark in everyone we meet?
That's a lot, but I see what you're saying. It goes back to that idea of service being how we show love. But there's another relationship the sermon kind of hints at, and it makes me a little uneasy. Our relationship with ourselves.
Ah, I knew we'd get there. We don't talk about that enough in spirituality, do we?
Right.
But this sermon, it's way ahead of its time. It says that self-love, like truly accepting ourselves, that's vital for this whole divine birth thing.
It's weird, right? We're taught to put ourselves last, that loving ourselves is selfish.
And yet this sermon is saying that embracing who we truly are, that's what allows us to embrace the divine all around us. It's like we can't truly love others until we love ourselves.
Wow, that really changes things. We started with this medieval sermon, and now we're talking about self-love as the key. Who knew?
And maybe that's the biggest lesson from all of this. The path to the divine isn't about some strict rules. It's about having a heart full of love. Love for ourselves, for other people, for that divine spark that connects us all.
That's beautiful and powerful. It's simple, but it really makes you think. And it's something we can all try to do wherever we are on our own journeys.
Exactly. It's a lifelong journey, but it's the journey we're meant for.
I completely agree. I'm feeling really inspired right now. This has been such a great reminder that the answers we're looking for, they're often closer than we think, like right here in our own hearts.
So true. And sometimes it's the most unexpected things, like an old sermon, that wake us up to that.
You got that right. Well, on that note, I think it's time for all of us to find a little silence, a little solitude, and let this all sink in.
Let's go find our wilderness.
Until next time, everyone, keep diving deep. And remember, the greatest treasures, they're often found within.